Well, I find myself in a difficult position because I'm kind of aware in America, and I'm not American, as you can tell, that that the separation of church and state is deeply ingrained in the American politic, and rightly so. And John Kennedy, when challenged on his Catholicism, rightly said this is a separate matter, and as long as I don't bring my Catholicism into policy, you've nothing to complain about. And this is very, very, very laudable. But going back to the doctor, the hypothetical doctor and the astronomer, if you knew that one of the candidates that you're contemplating voting for believed that in the 19th century, a man called Joseph Smith dug up some golden tablets which he translated and then conveniently lost, and translated, moreover, although a 19th century man translated them into 17th century English, and lots and lots of other...
And more importantly, unlike some of the... I mean, we also agree that the biblical stories are equally ridiculous, but the difference is we don't know they were written by known con men, but in fact he was a known felon.
Yes, that is true. And so if the person you're contemplating voting for believes all that, believes that the Garden of Eden was in Missouri, believes that Native Americans are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, believes that Jesus visited North America. I mean, these beliefs are barking mad. They contradict everything that's known historically, archaeologically. They contradict science, they contradict history. Now, is it a fair defense for such a candidate to say, oh, well, don't worry, I won't let my beliefs interfere with my policies? Well, maybe he won't, but do you want to vote for somebody who's capable of holding in his head such unrealistic nonsense? I mean, do you want a president who believes palpably foolish things, even if he promises that he won't actually let them? It's just back to the problem of the doctor and the astronomer again. In the God delusion, I made a 7-point scale. 1 is I'm totally confident there is a God. 7 is I'm totally confident there is not a God. 6 is, to all intents and purposes, I'm an atheist. I live my life as though there is no God. But any scientist of any sense will not say that they positively can disprove the existence of anything. I cannot disprove the existence of the Easter Bunny, and so I'm agnostic about the Easter Bunny. It's in the same respect that I'm agnostic about God. Why we exist, you're playing with the word why there. Science is working on the problem of the antecedent factors that lead to our existence. Now, why in any further sense than that, why in the sense of purpose, is, in my opinion, not a meaningful question. You cannot ask a question like, why do mountains exist, as though mountains had some kind of purpose. What you can say is, what are the causal factors that lead to the existence of mountains? And the same with life, and the same with the universe. Now, science over the centuries has gradually pieced together answers to those questions. Why in that sense? It's true that there are still some gaps, but surely, Cardinal, you're not going to fall for the God of the gaps trap of saying that that religion is going to fill in those gaps which science has so far not yet answered. It's true that Christianity has adopted many of the best values of humanity, but they don't belong to Christianity or indeed to any other religion. I think it would be very sad if it were true that you really did need religion in order to be good. Because if you think about it, what that would mean would be either that you get your morals and your values from the Bible or the Quran or some other holy book, or that you are good only because you're frightened of God, because you don't want to go to hell or you do want to go to heaven. Now, as for getting your morals from the Bible, I very sincerely hope nobody does get their morals from the Bible. It's true that you can find the occasional good verse, and the Sermon on the Mount would be one example, but it's lost amid the awful things that are dotted throughout the Old Testament, and actually throughout the New Testament as well, because the fundamental idea of New Testament Christianity, which is that Jesus is the Son of God who is redeeming humanity from original sin, the idea that we are born in sin, and the only way we can be redeemed from sin is through the death of Jesus. I mean, that's a horrible idea. It's a horrible idea that God, this paragon of wisdom and knowledge, power, couldn't think of a better way to forgive us our sins than to come down to earth in his alter ego as his son and have himself hideously tortured and executed so that he could forgive him. I think that religion teaches people to stop questioning. I'm sure you disagree with that, but the way I see it, it is such a privilege to be born at all. It's a very improbable event that either of us were born. We have the privilege of being in this universe for a few decades. And during that time, it is an enormous privilege to be able to understand something about the universe in which we live, why we're here, why we were ever born, where we come from. And I think that is such a wonderful thing to be able to do that I am hostile, I can get angry about competing accounts which seem to me to not encourage that kind of questioning, but instead to say, this is how it is, it's all written in the Holy Book, it was written 2,000 years ago, and that's the end of it. I think that deprives people. I think that is such a belittling, a demeaning view of the universe, and I think it's tragic that children are brought up with that when they could be brought up in a more open-minded way. So that's one reason for the anger. The other reason we've touched upon, it is that I do think that faith, unsupported by evidence, is a lethal weapon. Doesn't have to be, of course it doesn't have to be, but it can be. It's a weapon because possibly unscrupulous people can get hold of often young men and use them as weapons, use them as human bombs. And the only reason they can be deployed as human bombs is that they have been brought up from childhood onwards to believe implicitly, without question, that whatever the particular religion is, the details don't matter. The point is that they do believe that it is the will of God that they should detonate themselves and blow up a busload of people or blow up a skyscraper in New York. I don't think that any kind of reasoned argument would do that to people.
And I felt the presence of the Lord. I have had that personal experience in a way that whatever you say with fancy Darwin talk, I have felt it the way I felt this chair.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I'm not impressed by that because there are a similar number of people who are who brought up Hindus and say, I felt the presence of Lord Krishna and etc. I mean, there are all sorts of illusions that the human brain is very capable of creating. And
that's an illusion. Those people,
yeah.
Those people deluded, those people that say they have had a religious experience?
I think they are, yes.
Those people who say that we have experienced a miracle, that God has interceded in the world.
So. Yes, most definitely.
That's a delusion.
Yes.
The notion that raising Lazarus from the dead.
Oh, of course. I mean, that kind of story happens so easily. It happens to this day. There are all sorts of people reporting miracles all the time. And we don't, you don't believe them because it doesn't happen to chime in with the religion in which you were brought up.
Many people have criticized you, and when they read the God delusion, for example, you talk about the Jewish God, and you say genocidal, homophobic, racist. You use very provocative terms.
Well, that's the Abrahamic God, which is the God of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Yes.
Yeah, you are absolutely provocative on your descriptions.
Read Leviticus, read Deuteronomy. I don't need to do any more than just quote.
But is that a caricature to take the worst or the most fundamentalist, literalist readings of it, as opposed to the thousands of years of evolution of all of those religions?
Two things to say about that. One is that there are many people in this world who do take the Bible or the Quran literally, and literally do think that you should stone homosexuals to death or whatever it might be. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that even those people who don't say that, those people who have, as you say, evolved, have moved on. They have moved on for secular reasons. We've now abolished slavery. We now give equal rights to women. We now give votes to women. That's nothing to do with Scripture. That's nothing to do with the Bible. That's come about in spite of the Bible. And people have now gone back to the Bible and said, oh, well, we'll leave out that bit. We'll leave out that bit. It
Although
doesn't chime in with modern
some would
views.
say the abolishment of slavery was very much inspired by the Bible, even though slavery might have been the same.
Well, you've got to be joking, because what you're saying is that you can, if you look through the Bible, pick a verse. You can probably find a verse that you can read as abolishing slavery, and then you've got another verse that says you should keep slaves. So you're picking and choosing. That's all I'm saying. We don't get our morals from the Bible because we pick and choose on the basis of a modern morality which has evolved. You're quite right to say it's evolved. It's evolved for secular reasons, and now with hindsight, having evolved our morality for secular reasons, we can go back to the Bible and we can, as it were, rub out the bits that don't fit with our modern secular morality. Just don't read them anymore, and that's what people do.
Okay, my last question. This is probably going to be the most simplest one for you to answer, but what if you're wrong?
Well, what if I'm wrong? I mean, anybody could be wrong. We could all be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster and the pink unicorn and the flying teapot. You happen to have been brought up, I would presume, in the Christian faith. You know what it's like not to believe in a particular faith because you're not a Muslim, you're not a Hindu. Why aren't you a Hindu? Because you happen to have been brought up in America, not in India. If you'd been brought up in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you were brought up in Denmark in the time of the Vikings, you'd be believing in Wotan and Thor. If you were brought up in classical Greece, you'd be believing in Zeus. If you were brought up in Central Africa, you'd be believing in the great Juju up the mountain. There's no particular reason to pick on the Judeo-Christian God in which by the sheerest accident you happen to have been brought up, and ask me the question, what if I'm wrong? What if you're wrong about the great Juju at the bottom of the sea?
Here we have this phenomenally sophisticated information processor, which is the cell. Am I really to believe that that information processing capacity simply came about by the laws of nature and random processes without a mind?
Yes.
Well,
absolutely.
I find that impossible to believe as a mathematician.
I know you do. This is called the argument from personal incredulity.
Yes, exactly.
But you've suddenly leapt from sophisticated discussions of the origin of the universe, where one can have a proper discussion about whether some sort of cosmic intelligence could have set forth the laws of physics. And you suddenly jump to a man who lived 2,000 years ago, was born of a virgin, rose again from the dead.
Well, I only did that because you mentioned it first at the beginning.
I think that's petty. By comparison with the grandeur of the universe. I mean, to put my point again, do you really think that the creator of this magnificent edifice of the universe, the expanding universe, the galaxies, he really couldn't think of a better way to get rid of the sins on this one little speck of dust than to have himself tortured? He's the one who's doing the forgiving after all. Couldn't he just have forgiven? I think there's something wonderful about standing up and facing up to a universe where we are increasing our understanding, and we throw away childhood obsessions, we throw away the sort of imaginary friend that comforts us when we're children, and we feel the need for some kind of parent figure to turn to. I think when we grow up, we need to cast that aside and stand up tall in the universe. And it's cold, and we're not going to last for it. We're going to die, and we face up to that. And I think that's a nobler way of getting through life than to pin your hopes on childhood illusions. I don't think it's a very important question whether Jesus existed. There are some historians, most historians think he did, some
They
historians
certainly
don't.
do. I couldn't find an ancient historian that didn't.
Well, there are one or two, but I don't really care, actually, because precisely because it's petty. I mean, you could possibly persuade me that there was some kind of creative force in the universe. There was some kind of physical, mathematical genius who created everything. The expanding universe, devised quantum theory, relativity, and all that. You could possibly persuade me of that. But that is radically and fundamentally incompatible with the sort of God who cares about sin, the sort of God who cares about what you do with your genitals, the sort of God who is interested, who has the slightest interest in your private thoughts and wickednesses and things like that. Surely you can see that a God who's grand enough to make the universe is not going to give a tuppenny cuss about what you're thinking about and your sins and things like that.
So you think that morality is not important?
Of course I don't think morality is not important. I'm a human being.
Sounds like you're saying it isn't important.
I'm a human being, and I live in a society of human beings, and within a society of human beings, morality is of course important. But we are one of billions of planets on a huge scale, and a cosmic God who bothers about this kind of human scale is not the kind of God that is compatible with a scientific view of the universe. It's a medieval view. Now, in the case of the cosmos, freak accident or design, the point that I've made over and over again is that even if we don't understand how it came about, it's not helpful to postulate a creator, because the creator is the very kind of thing that needs an explanation. And although it's difficult enough to explain how a very simple origin of the universe came into being, how matter and energy, how one or two physical constants came into existence, although it's difficult enough to think how simplicity came into existence, it's a hell of a lot harder to think how something as complicated as a God comes into existence, difficult enough to think of how a deist God comes into existence, and even more difficult to think of how a Christian God who actually cares about things like sin and gets himself born of a virgin. There are many people who call themselves agnostic, and I want to clarify this. It's rather a confusing term. I put up here a scale of religiosity from 1 to 7, where 1 is, I know there is a God, and 7 is, I know there is no God, and we've got a scale of intermediate agnostic positions in between. 4 is exactly 50%. Number 4, agnostic, believes that the probability of God existing and not existing is exactly equal. Number 2 is, I don't exactly know there's a God, but I have a very high probability. I believe in a very high probability of there being a God. I'm a de facto theist. I can't know for certain, but I strongly believe in God and live my life on the assumption that he's there. A number 6, at the other end, is somebody who believes there's a very low probability of God existing, but still not quite 0. I'm a de facto atheist. I can't know for certain, but I think God is very improbable, and I live my life on the assumption that he isn't there. I'm a number 6. I'm an agnostic, but with the same level of belief in God as I have belief in fairies or unicorns. Bertrand Russell illustrated this with his parable of the celestial teapot. He pointed out that it is impossible to disprove the hypothesis that there is a china teapot in orbit around Earth, or around the Sun, between the orbits of Earth and Mars. We therefore all have to be agnostic about the teapot theory, but in practice we are all a-teapotists. I want to make it clear that the agnostic position does not, should not, be confused with an exact 50-50 probability position. There are people who quite wrongly and illogically say, you can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God, therefore there's an exactly 50% probability of God existing. It's like tossing a penny. That, of course, is completely illogical. Just because you cannot disprove something, and the teapot example shows that, it doesn't mean the odds of it being there are 50%, and you can quickly see that with the example of the teapot. Yes, well, that concluding bit rather gives the game away, doesn't it? All that stuff about science and physics and the complications of physics and things. What it really comes down to is the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, there's a fundamental incompatibility between the sort of sophisticated scientist, which we hear part of the time from John Lennox, and it's impressive, and we are interested in the argument about multiverses and things. And then having produced some sort of a case for a kind of deistic God, perhaps, some God, the great physicist who adjusted the laws and constants of the universe, and that's all very grand and wonderful. And then suddenly we come down to the resurrection of Jesus. It's so petty, it's so trivial, it's so local, it's so earthbound, it's so unworthy of the universe. When we go into a garden and we see how beautiful it is, and we see colored flowers, and we see the butterflies and the bees, of course it's natural to think there must be a gardener. Any fool is likely to think there must be a gardener. The huge achievement of Darwin was to show that that didn't have to be true. Of course it's difficult. Of course it had to wait until the mid-19th century before anybody thought of it. It seems so obvious that if you've got a garden, there must be a gardener who created it and all that goes with that. What Darwin did was to show the staggeringly counterintuitive fact that this not only can be explained by an undirected process. It's not chance, by the way. Entirely wrong to say it's chance. It's not chance. Natural selection is the very opposite of chance, and that's the essence of it. That was what Darwin discovered. He showed not only a garden, but everything in the living world, and in principle not just on this earth, but on any other planet, wherever you see the organized complexity that we understand, that we call life, that it has an explanation which can derive it from simple beginnings by comprehensible rational means. That is possibly the greatest achievement that any human mind has ever accomplished. Not only did he show that it could be done, I believe that we can argue that that the alternative is so unparsimonious and so counter to the laws of common sense that, reluctant as we might be, because it might be unpleasant for us to admit it, although we can't disprove that there's a God, it is very, very unlikely indeed.
Cynical is not the right word. I become a practical cynic. There are people who think this way or feel that way or behave this other way. And I've stopped trying to change them. What I try to do is offer a way of looking at the world that maybe they'll take, maybe they won't. Maybe as an educator, it's my job to make this as tasty as possible so that, hey, that's a good idea. I never thought about it that way. But otherwise, I just gave a presentation to a Christian school, K through 12. I talked about optics. And at the end, there was open Q&A, and they were 11th graders, and they started grilling me on science versus the Bible. And I said, I'm not here to stop you from being religious at all. Okay, we live in a country that protects your freedom to be religious, and you're in a private school. So the government is not going to come after you and say you have to get this out of the public coffers. I made that clear, but I didn't have the urge to try to convert them. And I get the sense that you've had this urge your entire life to convert people with no less zeal than a religious person, a religious evangelical religious person would have trying to convert people who are not that. Did I tell you? I didn't tell you this. We have a Big Bang Theater here.
Yes.
And back when we first opened here at the Hayden Planetarium, there's a separate theater space where we just talk about the Big Bang. Someone came out of the Big Bang, saw me and says, how come you didn't mention God in there? And then I realized, okay, what am I going to do? I say, how about this? Why don't you go to our Hall of Human Evolution and then come back here? And when I tell them to do that, they never come back because that's way more offensive to them having monkeys and humans
Yes.
hold hands in the dioramas
Yes.
than anything we could ever say in the Big Bang here.
I thought they'd rather like the Big Bang. I mean, the Big Bang sounds pretty much like Genesis.
It's a creation event. Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe that's why they thought we should have mentioned God and didn't. But I don't even have the conversation. I just send them over to your part of the museum.
Yes. But I think you're being too pusillanimous. You shouldn't duck the question.
Well, I don't duck it so much as sometimes I don't have the energy.
Oh, that's different.
Okay.
I get that too.
You feel that?
I understand that. But in my field, that really is an absolute opposition.
Yes.
It's not something you
complete. Although the Catholic Church, they've met you in the middle.
Yeah, they have.
They said, we have this branch of primates, and then God breathed the soul into
Right,
them,
yes.
and they're humans, allowing evolution all up to that point.
Yeah.
That's you got to give them something. You got to
not
no.
a step. Not a,
But the world is not that binary. It's not that binary. I don't see
Yes,
it that
is.
way. There are religious people who are where Jesus is their savior, but they're perfectly fine with a 4.5 billion year old Earth.
Yes, they are.
Okay, they're not at the extreme.
They don't.
So-
They don't see the contradiction. But yes.
So maybe the plurality of the world is a feature rather than a bug of the programming of what it is to be human.
But the truth is so much more grand and so much more elegant and so much more poetic and so much more beautiful. Why drag Jesus in?
And I would still claim you could get more of that across if people didn't feel stupid talking to you.
Yeah, that's
Great. So did I tell you this? Do you remember there was this, it was on YouTube, it was what's called Double Rainbow Guy. Have you ever seen this?
no.
Double Rainbow. You should check it out.
Okay.
Okay, this is now back when social media was just people posting things. It wasn't the cesspool that it is today.
Yes.
So he was hiking somewhere. There's some guy you needed a camcorder to take videos,
Yes.
not a cell phone. He's hiking in was Sierra Madres. I don't remember where. And you hear him sort of narrating oh, that's a nice cliff. Then he turns a corner and he says, oh, a rainbow. Oh my gosh. What could it mean? Oh, a double rainbow. Oh my gosh. And he's tearing. You don't see him, but you can easily interpret just his emotions and his breath. And then he goes prostrate to the ground.
Yes.
And he can't contain himself. What does it mean? This is a sign. And so I felt bad doing this. You might be proud of me, but I felt bad doing this. I tweeted, I put a link to this video, and I said, this is how you behave if you've never studied physics.
Yes.
But I thought that was kind of mean. He's having his moment.
Well, in a way, that's what Keats was doing. And that's
To
what
Newton.
Yes, that's right. But anyway, I can cap your story in the opposite direction. I read a story about a woman in California. She had a lawn sprinkler, and she saw a rainbow in the lawn sprinkler, and she said, "What are they doing to our water supply?"
That's funny. Oh my God. Blind Watchmaker. Oh, that's my favorite book of yours, if I
Thank you.
may.
Okay. Well, The Watchmaker comes from William Paley, the theologian, who said that there must be a God because if you find a watch, you pick up the watch. He was crossing a heath, he said. You open it up. There's a great big pocket watch in those days.
Back when watches were watches.
Yes, that's right. And you see all the cogwheels and springs and things. It had to have a designer, of course it did. And so how much more would you say that of an eye or a knee joint or anything living? So that's the Paley watchmaker argument. Natural selection is the blind watchmaker. It produces results that are like watches. They're beautifully designed. Eyes are beautifully designed. Certain flaws, but they are beautifully designed. And they come about not through any design process, not through any deliberate design, but through the blind watchmaker, which is natural selection. So
So that's hard for people to accept, especially if they're deeply religious.
Yes.
Because they already have an account.
Yes.
Now you're saying one of the acts of their God is some random force operating.
He didn't have to be there at all.
He didn't have to be there at all.
Yes.
And I think where people get confused, and even some of our people have made this mistake, Fred Hoyle, who was the architect of the steady state universe, who pejoratively invented the name Big Bang to describe the universe beginning in one point. He said that in a pejorative way. He wanted the universe to be a steady state. He did a calculation for how you would get an eye, a fully functioning eye, and how long that would take. And it was some impossibly, 10 to the some very high power number of years, given the rate at which you have defects in a genome. And correct me if I'm wrong, the rebuttal to that is natural selection is not completely random.
Well, no, that's right. It actually wasn't an eye. It was a hemoglobin molecule, but it's the same argument anyway. So what he overlooked was that it doesn't happen all in one go. He imagined all the bits coming together at random.
And that's one case that doesn't work, and it has another random thing that doesn't work.
Yes.
And you do that forever.
You do that forever. Of course you want, but what you need is, let's use the eye, even though he didn't. You need a slightly less good eye, and then a slightly less good eye, and a slightly less good eye. And if you start with just a sheet of light-sensitive cells, which just detect whether it's light or dark, that's useful. It's not light.
It's better than not having it.
It's better than not having it. You can tell when it's night or day. You can tell whether there's a predator flying overhead. And then if you have a slightly cup-shaped, if you bend that retina from a flat thing into a slight cup, then if it's coming from that direction, it hits that side of the. We are on video, aren't we? Yes. And so you get, it's not an image, but it gives a slight directionality. And then you close up and you start to get a pinhole camera. It's a very crude, it's out of focus, but it's sort of an image. And then you need a little bit of transparent gunk in there. It's not a proper lens, but it does something like a lens. And all these stages, one by one, they step by step, they incrementally improve.
And every improvement is the new starting place for the variations at that generation.
That's right, and then you get improvement.
Because every generation is not starting from zero.
That's right, yes.
So The Blind Watchmaker, I just thought that was brilliantly written, and it was my benchmark for, if I were to ever write a book for the public, I want to be this articulate.
Oh, wow, that's high praise, Neil.
I just want you to know that.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Richard Dawkins is one of the most influential and controversial thinkers of our time. A staunch advocate for atheism and scientific rationalism, his critiques of religion have reshaped public discourse on faith, skepticism, and secularism. Yet, while many atheists admire his dismantling of religion dogma like myself, his recent comments on transgender rights have sparked fierce backlash even among his most staunch supporters. I know that is a touchy subject, but I think it's essential to mention if we're going to make a video that is solely dedicated to Richard Dawkins. So with that in mind, in this section of the video, we'll explore Dawkins' impact on atheism, his arguments against religion, and why some of his views, particularly on trans issues, have become so divisive in the most recent years, man. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Anyway, before Dawkins became the face of atheism, he was already a big deal in science. His book, The Selfish Gene, changed how we talked about evolution, introducing ideas so catchy that they practically went viral. And actually, he is the reason we even call images memes today, like funny images, you know the sorts. That said, it was the God Delusion book that turned him into a cultural lightning rod. Suddenly, atheism wasn't just some quiet philosophy, it was basically a movement, man. And Dawkins, with others like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, were leading the charge. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't alive. Okay, I was alive, but I was basically a baby at the time all this was happening. But yeah, I can imagine it was a time to be alive, man. Anyway, so let's get back to Richard Dawkins. In the book we just mentioned, he didn't just argue that God probably doesn't exist. He basically said belief itself was dangerous, a kind of mental virus that held back progress. And honestly, for a lot of us who grew up in religious environments, hearing someone say that out loud was basically liberating. Even a decade later, when I finally got to listen to some of his best speeches. When I started listening to the man, I could tell right away that Dawkins had this way of cutting through centuries of theological jargon with simple, brutal logic, just like Christopher Hitchens did. His argument was simple, man. Why believe in a creator when evolution explains life's complexity? Why let religion dictate morality when humans are perfectly capable of ethics without divine threats? And if you watched his debates, you already know they were legendary, man. Watching him dismantle arguments from bishops and theologians felt like watching a chess master checkmate in basically 3 moves. He made skepticism look cool, or at least he made it loud and for a generation of atheists that mattered, including the later generation that I'm included in. And ladies and gentlemen, it is hard to overstate how much Dawkins shifted the conversation, because before him, atheists were often seen as cranks or contrarians basically. After him, however, skepticism had a seat at the table. He helped create spaces, books, conferences, online forums, etc., where non-believers could say, without any fear of contradiction, hey, I'm not alone in the belief that God probably doesn't exist. Organizations like his foundation pushed for secular education, fought against religious privileges in laws, and gave atheists a sense of community, which might seem like nothing, but it was a big deal back at the time, man. So, without further ado, let's jump onto his controversy. Yeah. Over the last few years, Dawkins has made headlines, and not the good kind, man, for his comments on transgender issues. If you've watched the videos, you already know that he's basically dismissed gender identity as fashionable nonsense and generally doubled down on the kind of threats that feel, well, weirdly unscientific for a guy who built his career on following the evidence, and it is frustrating for most people, I believe, because guys, major medical associations, from the American Psychological Association to the World Health Organization, already recognize that trans identities are real and valid. The science on gender isn't as simplistic as XS or XY chromosomes, end of story. But as we have witnessed over the last several years, Dawkins, who usually is all about data, suddenly seems to be ignoring it. Yeah, which is disappointing, but where does that leave us, man? I'm personally still grateful for what Dawkins did for atheism. He made it okay to question, to demand evidence, and to push back against dogma. But needless to say, part of critical thinking is recognizing when your heroes miss the mark. And on trans issues and trans rights, Dawkins isn't just missing the mark, in my opinion. He's basically firing in the wrong opposite direction. So yeah, that's it for today. I really hope you've enjoyed the video. Ladies and gentlemen, please let me know what you think about the compilation that I've given you. If you'd like to see me cover more videos from a particular person, please let me know in the comment section below. Otherwise, stay safe, have a nice time. I'll see you in the next one, man. Peace.